What happens when Britain's most beloved comedy icon sits down for what should have been a light, friendly morning chat, only to be met with a host determined to tear him apart on live television? It took just 29 seconds for Lorraine Kelly to make the comment that would shatter her carefully crafted reputation and turn her own show into a battleground she could never hope to win. The morning had begun like any other inside the bright, bustling ITV studios. Lorraine Kelly settled into her signature yellow chair, her practice smile already fastened in place as cameras were adjusted and cue cards were arranged. Today's guest was Rowan Atkinson, internationally adored, instantly recognizable, and respected for decades of work that had shaped British comedy. He was there to talk about his latest project, a simple, straightforward interview. At least, that's what everyone expected. But the moment Rowan stepped onto the set, something felt off. The warmth usually extended to guests was noticeably absent. Instead, Lorraine regarded him almost dismissively, as though he were some sort of sideshow curiosity she'd been forced to tolerate. "Right then," she said flatly, not even rising from her chair as he approached. "Rowan Atkinson, everyone, the man who made a career out of not talking." The audience let out an awkward, uncertain laugh. Rowan greeted the room with his usual politeness, though a brief flicker of discomfort crossed his face. Still, he maintained his professionalism. "Thank you for having me, Lorraine," he said evenly. "Oh, we had to, really," she shot back with a harsh little laugh. "Your people have been calling us for weeks, desperate to get you on, weren't they?" It was the first clear warning sign. Rowan raised his eyebrow but kept his composure. "Well, I do have a new film coming out, so naturally we thought your viewers might be interested." "Might be," she muttered, flipping through her notes with theatrical disinterest. Then, without warning, she went in for the first strike. "Forgive me for being blunt, but don't you think you're getting a bit old for all this physical comedy nonsense? You're not exactly a spring chicken anymore." A chill swept across the studio. Even the crew shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't playful teasing. It was a calculated jab. Rowan leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "Oh, don't play dumb with me," Lorraine said, leaning forward like a predator closing in. "You're 68. Isn't it time to hang up the rubber faces and silly walks? Leave all that to the younger crowd." "I wasn't aware there was an age limit on entertaining people," Rowan replied, the edge in his voice now unmistakable. "There isn't officially," she said with syrupy mock sympathy. "But let's be honest, there's something a bit sad about watching an older man try to be funny, like your grandfather trying to act hip, embarrassing for everyone involved." The audience gasped. It was clear she'd crossed the line, yet Lorraine pressed on, sensing momentum in her own cruelty. "Mr. Bean was what, 20 years ago? And it wasn't exactly Shakespeare, was it? A grown man behaving like a toddler? What does that say about British comedy standards?" Rowan's hands clasped tightly in his lap, the tension visible, though his voice remained steady. "Mr. Bean has brought joy to millions, children, adults, families around the world. I'm rather proud of that." "Are you, though?" she needled. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a man who peaked decades ago and is desperately clinging to relevance. When was the last time you did anything genuinely funny? And don't say Johnny English. That was just Mr. Bean in a suit." Silence smothered the studio. This was no longer an interview. It had become a public ambush. "Lorraine," Rowan said quietly, "I came here to discuss my new project, not to be psychoanalyzed by someone who believes morning television grants them authority over artistic merit." Artistic merit. Listen to him. Artistic merit from the man who built his career on pulling faces and falling over. She turned to the audience expecting laughter, but instead of amusement, she was met with stunned, heavy silence, a silence that spoke louder than any punchline.
They hadn't come to watch their childhood hero get ripped apart by a bitter morning show host. Yet that was exactly what was unfolding live on air. Lorraine Kelly, sensing blood in the water, leaned forward with a venom-laced smile. "You know what I think?" she said, turning back to Rowan with a voice sharpened like a blade. "I think you're jealous. Jealous of real comedians. People like Jimmy Carr, Sarah Millican. People who actually have wit and intelligence. People who don't need playground antics to get a laugh." A ripple of discomfort swept across the studio. Rowan's composure, legendary after decades in the public eye, was beginning to crack. A faint twitch appeared in his left eye. His breathing grew tighter. This was a man who had always been gracious, always professional, always kind, even in the face of criticism. But Lorraine was pushing him past the point any reasonable person could endure. "Those are fine comedians," he said at last, his voice taut with controlled anger. "But comedy isn't a competition, Lorraine. There's room for different styles, different approaches." "Is there, though? Because it seems to me like your style went out with the arc. Physical comedy is dead, Rowan, dead and buried. And the sooner you accept that and step aside for people with actual talent, the better off we'll all be." That was the breaking point, the moment the atmosphere shifted. Rowan Atkinson, the man who for 40 years had brought joy to millions, who had never once spoken unkindly about a colleague, finally reached his limit. He leaned forward in his chair, eyes fixed on Lorraine like cold steel. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried decades of dignity, restraint, and hard-earned wisdom. "Talent," he repeated slowly. "You want to talk about talent, do you?" For the first time during the entire interview, Lorraine's confidence faltered. A flicker of unease crossed her face, but it was too late to retreat. "Yes," she continued, standing up from her chair in one smooth, deliberate motion. The studio lights seemed to dim as he rose to his full height, towering over the host, who moments ago had mocked him with such smug assurance. Now she looked small and suddenly very aware that she had gone too far. "Sit down, Rowan," she ordered, grasping for control. "We're in the middle of an interview." "No," he replied sharply. "We're in the middle of an ambush, and I'm done being your victim." He turned to the audience, placing his back to Lorraine. Every person in the studio leaned in, breath held, knowing they were witnessing something they would never forget. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rowan began, his voice clear and resonant, "I've been in show business for over 40 years. I've worked with some of the brightest minds in comedy. I've performed for royalty, for children, for families across the world. And in all that time, I have never encountered someone so desperate to tear down another person's life's work just to make themselves feel important." Lorraine's mouth dropped open. This was not the quiet, mild-mannered man she had expected to bully. "Now, hang on," she sputtered. "I'm talking now," Rowan said, without even glancing her way. "You had your turn. You had 20 minutes to reveal exactly what kind of person you are. Now it's my turn." He turned back to her, and the look in his eyes made her sink deeper into her yellow chair. "You want to talk about talent, Lorraine? Let's talk about yours. What exactly is it you do here? You read from a teleprompter. You ask questions someone else writes for you. You smile on cue and pretend to care about celebrities you've never met. Where's the talent in that?" The studio was so silent it felt sacred. "At least when I pull a face or take a pratfall, I'm doing something. I'm giving someone a moment of joy. I'm making a child laugh. I'm helping a tired worker forget their troubles for half an hour. What do you do? Sit in that chair and tear people down so you can feel better about your own mediocrity." Lorraine tried to object, her voice trembling. "I think you're being rather unfair." "Unfair?" Rowan's voice finally rose. "You spent 20 minutes telling me I'm too old, that my work is worthless, that I should step aside. You called my life's work embarrassing, and you think I'm being unfair?" He began pacing now, his hands animated, his voice steady and rising, as the entire studio watched in stunned silence.
The physical comedian was gone. In his place stood a man carrying 40 years of swallowed insults, misunderstandings, and quiet endurance, finally reaching his breaking point. Rowan Atkinson's voice trembled not with fear, but with long-suppressed truth. "Do you know what Mr. Bean has done for this world?" he asked, his tone cutting through the tension like a razor. "Do you have any idea?" He paused, letting the silence settle. "I've received letters from parents telling me their autistic children spoke their first words while watching Bean. I've heard from soldiers in Afghanistan who said my films helped them survive the darkest moments of their lives. I've met children in hospital wards who forgot their pain for an hour because of something I created." Lorraine was shrinking visibly, retreating into her chair as if the cushions could shield her from the consequences of her own cruelty. "Rowan, I think we should—" "But what have you created, Lorraine? What's your legacy? 30 years of asking celebrities about their new haircuts? 30 years of reading gossip off cards and pretending it's journalism? You sit there judging my work? But what work? Where is your creative output? Where are the things you've made that will outlast you?" The cameras kept rolling. Producers were no doubt shouting into headsets in the control room, but no one dared step onto that set. No one was willing to touch the live wire the interview had become. "You know what's really sad?" Rowan continued, his voice dropping again, quiet, controlled, and infinitely more dangerous. "It's not an old man trying to make people laugh. It's a bitter woman so threatened by joy that she has to destroy it wherever she finds it. Someone so insecure about their own lack of substance that they attack anyone who actually brings something meaningful into the world." Lorraine finally managed to speak, though her voice came out thin and trembling. "I was just asking questions." "No," Rowan said, stepping closer until he stood at the edge of her desk, staring straight into her eyes. "You thought wrong." The studio seemed to stop breathing. "Let me tell you something about comedy, Lorraine. Real comedy comes from truth, from understanding people, their struggles, their joys, and reflecting those truths back to them in a way that helps them cope with life. Physical comedy, the kind you mock so casually, is the purest form of all. It crosses every language barrier, every cultural divide. A child in Japan and a grandmother in Scotland can watch the same pratfall and both burst into laughter." He stepped back slightly, allowing his words to fill the room. "That's not easy. That's not simple. That's miraculous." The audience murmured in agreement, the shift in energy unmistakable. The man Lorraine had tried to portray as outdated and irrelevant was standing in front of them more powerful than ever, graceful, articulate, unshakable. "But what you do here," Rowan gestured around the studio, "isn't about bringing people together or making their lives better. It's about feeding your ego. It's about making yourself feel important by making others feel small. And frankly," he paused, letting the weight of the moment settle, "it's pathetic." Rand looked around desperately, as though hoping someone, anyone, would save her from the storm she had summoned. No help came. "You called my work playground antics," Rowan said, straightening. "Well, maybe that's exactly what the world needs more of. Maybe we need more playground joy and less boardroom cruelty. Maybe we need more people willing to look foolish if it means making someone else smile. And fewer people like you who think tearing others down makes them look smart." He turned back to the audience, his voice swelling with conviction. "I've been called a lot of things. Silly, childish, simple. And you know what? I wear those labels proudly. Because if being silly means bringing happiness to millions, then I'll be silly until the day I die. If being childish means remembering how to find wonder in the world, then I'll stay childish forever. And if being simple means I don't need to hurt others to feel good about myself, then simple is exactly what I want to be. The audience erupted, not with the shallow, rehearsed applause of daytime TV, but genuine, heartfelt appreciation. Lorraine sat frozen, trapped in the very chair from which she had launched her attack. Only now did she realize she had chosen the wrong target. The applause eventually faded, but the charged atmosphere lingered. Rowan stood tall, composed once more, while Lorraine Kelly seemed to fold into herself, desperate to disappear. And he wasn't finished. Not yet.
"You know what the real tragedy is here, Lorraine?" he said at last, his voice no longer sharp, but steady, calm, and weighted with a depth that made every person in the studio lean forward instinctively. The anger was gone. What replaced it was far more disarming, something quiet, something human. "It's not that you don't understand comedy," he continued. "It's that you don't understand people." Lorraine opened her mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. Her confidence, so solid moments earlier, dissolved under the gentleness of his tone. For the first time in the interview, she looked truly uncertain, perhaps even afraid. "When you mock physical comedy," he said, moving toward her desk again, "when you call it childish or outdated, you're not just attacking me or my work. You're dismissing every person who ever found comfort in laughter during their darkest hours. You're belittling every child who watched someone celebrate their own quirks on screen and realized maybe, just maybe, it was okay to be different." There was no aggression in his steps now, no tightness in his posture. What reached her instead was disappointment, and somehow it landed with far greater force than anger ever could. "I've met war veterans who told me that Mr. Bean helped them reconnect with their families after returning home, when they barely recognized the world around them. I've spoken to teachers who used my films to reach children who had all but given up on learning. I've heard from caregivers who said my comedy gave them 5 precious minutes of peace while caring for loved ones with dementia." The studio had fallen so silent that even the low hum of the cameras seemed loud. The audience didn't move, afraid to break the spell. "But to you," he said quietly, "all of that is just playground antics. All those moments of connection, all that healing made possible through laughter, to you it's nothing more than an old man making faces. Do you see how small that makes you look? How limited your understanding of what entertainment and humanity can be?" Lorraine finally found her voice. It trembled. I never meant to suggest that your work hasn't helped people." He tilted his head slightly, like a teacher gently correcting a mistaken student. "Didn't you? You said my comedy was embarrassing. You said it was time for me to step aside. You compared me to a desperate old man clinging to relevance. Those were your words, were they not?" She swallowed and nodded, knowing the entire country had heard her. "And now," he went on, "you're trying to walk it back because you realized you revealed something ugly about yourself on live television. But this," he said, gesturing around the studio, "is no longer about me. This is about the kind of person you choose to be." He turned toward the audience, including them in a way Lorraine never had. "We live in a world that seems to grow crueler every day. People hide behind screens and use them like weapons. They mock anyone who dares to be vulnerable or different or joyful. Somewhere along the way, we stopped understanding that kindness isn't weakness.
that bringing happiness to others is one of the highest callings a person can have. The audience hung on every word. It no longer felt like a rebuttal. It felt like a declaration, almost a plea for basic human decency. And someone like Lorraine gets a platform. She gets a microphone. She has the power to reach millions of people every morning. And what does she choose to do with that power? She uses it to make people feel small. She uses it to tell someone who has spent his life bringing joy to others that his work is worthless. Lorraine looked as if she might cry. Her once perfect makeup had begun to smudge and streak. "But here is what she doesn't understand," he said, his voice steady, rising with purpose. "You cannot diminish light by pointing out darkness, and you cannot make yourself taller by cutting others down."
And you certainly can't understand art, he continued, when you reduce it to your own narrow and bitter perspective. He walked back toward his chair, not quickly, not theatrically, but with the calm assurance of someone who no longer needed to defend himself. Yet he didn't sit. Instead, he stood with one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, looking more self-possessed, more dignified, and more powerful than Lorraine had ever appeared in her own studio. Physical comedy isn't just about making people laugh, he said. Though honestly, that alone would be enough. Laughter is not a small thing. But real physical comedy is about showing people that it's okay to fail, and to fail spectacularly. It's about demonstrating that dignity isn't some fragile performance where you never look foolish. Dignity comes from getting back up after you fall, from trying again, from embracing your oddities instead of pretending you don't have any. The cameras zoomed in on him, capturing every change in his expression, the steady conviction, the warmth, the underlying sadness at what had just unfolded. "Mr. Bean doesn't speak," he said softly, "because he doesn't need to. His humanity is in his actions, his emotions, his mistakes. He connects with people who feel like outsiders because he is an outsider, one who never stops trying. That's not childish, Lorraine. That's profound." Lorraine attempted one last desperate pivot. "Well, I think we can agree that no." Rowan's interruption was firm, final. "We can't agree, because we do not share the same values." The studio froze. "You value cynicism," he said, each word measured. "I value wonder. You value tearing things down. I value building them up. You value making people feel small. I value helping people feel like they belong in this world." He straightened his jacket, then turned directly toward the main camera. It felt almost like he was addressing the entire country. "To anyone watching, who creates something, anything, who puts a piece of themselves into the world in the hope of making it brighter, don't let people like this discourage you. The world needs your art, your humor, your strange uniqueness. Don't let bitter people convince you that joy is somehow less valuable than criticism." Then he did something no one expected. He smiled. Not the polite smile he'd worn when the interview began, but a warm, genuine smile that reminded everyone exactly why they had fallen in love with his work in the first place. "Thank you all for listening," he said to the audience. "And thank you, Lorraine, for reminding me why I do what I do. Sometimes we need to meet people who have forgotten how to find joy in order to remember how precious it really is." And with that, he walked toward the exit. The audience rose to their feet in an instant. The applause was thunderous, far louder than anything that show had ever produced. Some viewers wiped tears. Others were grinning like children rediscovering a lost magic. Lorraine remained at her desk, small and crumpled, surrounded by the aftermath of her own choices.
She had entered the interview believing she could embarrass a quiet comedian. Instead, she had been dismantled, calmly, gracefully, by a man who understood human nature better than she understood her own show. At the studio door, Rowan paused. He turned back one last time. "And oh, Lorraine, the next time you interview someone about their life's work, you might consider watching some of it first. You'd be amazed what you can learn when you approach something with an open mind instead of a closed heart." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the end of a symphony. The applause continued long after he had gone, and in the heavy silence that followed, one could almost hear the sound of a career collapsing and a legend rising even higher without needing a single pratfall, a single silly face, or anything more than words, wisdom, and an unwavering belief in human kindness.